And I'd like to introduce Genn and Jenny from Ancient History Fangirl. We've got a brilliant talk coming up all about Cleopatra, and I'm going to disappear now.
Thank you so much.
I'm Genn.
And I'm Jenny.
And we are the hosts of Ancient History Fangirl, and we're so excited today to talk to you about the incredible Cleopatra.
Yeah. So often when we think of the lives of historical figures like Cleopatra, it can look like things were preordained. But so frequently in Cleopatra's life, she was improvising. As plan A failed, she pulled out plans B, C, and D. But with hindsight, those start to look like plan A. Suddenly my screen is doing something weird too. In reality, Cleopatra was flexible, inventive, and courageous, and she always had a backup plan. In our presentation, we're going to look at her life, why she made the decisions she did, and how she operated as queen of the epic backup plan. Jen, do you want to add anything here?
No, you just keep going, babe. I'm gonna run the slideshow, and then I'll be here for the questions and answers.
Okay, yeah, we're having a little bit of difficulty sharing scripts right now, and it all kind of came to a head. So as a Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra grew up in a cutthroat environment. She would have learned some lessons early about the dangers of the world she was born into, and these affected decisions she made potentially for the rest of her life. Lesson 1, Alexandria had an angry mob problem. There was a divide between the Egyptian public and the Greek ruling class. Egypt had been colonized about 300 years ago by Ptolemy, an old general of Alexander the Great's, who was Macedonian Greek. And since then, Egyptian pharaohs were all Greek. They did not even speak Egyptian. There was understandable resentment over this, and the city of Alexandria was prone to riots. The Egyptian people were not afraid to attack pharaohs. At least that is what is according to the sources, and you do have to be aware of prejudice in the ancient sources.
Always take it with a giant salt lick, but don't lick that salt lick.
Don't lick anything in the ancient world.
No, especially Julius Caesar.
No, God.
No matter how much he begs, don't lick him.
I'm going to move on. So a number of Cleopatra's relatives had been killed by angry mobs. For example, Ptolemy the 11th, Cleopatra's dad's cousin, married his stepmother, cousin, half-sister. That was all the same person because Ptolemy's, and had her murdered 19 days later. She was popular with the Egyptian common people, though, and so an angry mob dragged Ptolemy the 11th out of his palace and hanged him in the street, and that is how Cleopatra's dad inherited the throne. When Cleopatra was 9, her father tried and failed to intervene when a visiting Roman dignitary accidentally killed a cat, and the Alexandrian mob ripped him limb from limb. Not too long after, when Cleopatra was 11, her dad almost faced the same fate. He didn't protest loudly enough when the Romans annexed Cyprus, and the Egyptians did not like the Romans, to put it mildly. Violent riots rocked the streets, and Cleo's dad had to flee Rome, barely escaping with his life. And when he got there, Cleo's dad started looking around for a rich Roman ally to fund an army that would put him back on his throne. And one of the main allies that he had was Pompey. Working around the Senate, who did not approve of this, Pompey got a general friend of his to do this job off the books. And one of the first things Cleo's dad did when he got back to Egypt was behead his oldest daughter, Berenice, who tried to take over in his absence. So all this happened before Cleopatra was 15. She learned that there is no safety or loyalty in family because her dad coldly executed her older sister. No safety among her own people because, the Egyptian public might kill you if they didn't like your foreign policy. But Rome could be a place to turn to if things got really bad. So Cleo's plan A was to become a populist. Cleopatra learned how to persuade and be charismatic based on her elite Greek education. She also learned 9 languages, including ancient Egyptian. She was the only Ptolemaic pharaoh to learn it. But let's get to Cleopatra's civil war and her time as a new pharaoh. So Cleopatra was 18 when she took the throne, ruling jointly with her 11-year-old brother. She inherited a country in turmoil, and there was widespread drought, famine, and unrest. Her country was still independent from Rome, but barely. The Roman Senate regularly intervened in Egyptian affairs. If Cleopatra didn't appease Rome, they could invade and take her country from her. But the Alexandrian populace did not like Rome, and they expressed their displeasure violently. So Cleopatra burnished her populace cred by sailing 600 miles upriver to Thebes to inaugurate a new Bacchus bull. She was trying to play both sides here. She also sided with Pompey during the civil war with Caesar. That was plan A. Pompey was the establishment, the likeliest to win, and she needed him as an ally. Cleopatra sent soldiers, a fleet of warships, and grain to Pompey. But the Egyptian public did not like what it was seeing. Why was Cleopatra sending grain to Rome when there was a famine on in Egypt? And her advisors did not like how she acted independently, so they kicked her out of her palace and made her 11-year-old brother sole ruler. So Cleo's epic backup plan was get Caesar's support. Cleopatra first tried to build up a mercenary army, but Ptolemy's advisors had a stronger army and military position. Even more bad news was that Pompey couldn't help her. He had lost his civil war, and when he showed up on her shores looking for help, her little brother's advisors had him beheaded. 3 days later, Caesar arrived in Alexandria. If Caesar picked sides, that could decide the war. Her brother had just sent Caesar the severed head of his greatest enemy as a gesture of friendship, and Cleopatra had picked the wrong side in the civil war of Rome. She'd sent aid to Pompey. If she didn't get to Caesar quickly and plead her case, he was going to side with her brother. I mean, chances were high he'd side with her brother anyway. So getting Caesar on her side was a long shot, and here's how Cleopatra did it. She abandoned royal trappings and hid at the bottom of a rowboat to get to Alexandria. She got herself snuck into the palace in a sack. She engineered the most perfect introduction to Caesar she possibly could. Caesar loved all this cloak and dagger stuff. He was always sneaking around through enemy territory at night and disguised, acting fast and decisively to surprise his enemies, and Cleopatra could not have pulled off a better introduction. So after that epic introduction, suddenly Caesar was ready to fight Cleo's battles. He and Cleopatra
spent... That was the perfect meet cute, Jenny. Like,
it was.
Couldn't be any better. Sorry, I need to run the PowerPoint, but I just had to say that. That is the Julius Caesar meet cute of all meet cutes.
It is the original meet cute, in my opinion. Like, the best. It's like kind of out of a romance novel, weirdly. He and Cleopatra spent an intense 10 months locked in her palace, fighting off her brother's army, and she emerged with her enemies dead, her country still independent, and herself as sole ruler, and she was pregnant with Caesar's baby. Her new plan A was to lock this guy down. So, Cleopatra visited Caesar in Rome. While there, you can see Caesar making some moves that were clearly influenced by her, and this is not limited to these. Here are a few examples. Caesar threw four lavish triumphs reminiscent of Ptolemaic excess rather than Roman restraint, and these may have been financed by Cleopatra. He started his own state-sponsored cult with Mark Antony as head priest, which is hilarious, reminiscent of Pharaoh's status as kings and gods. Laid plans for a great library in Rome, just like the one in Alexandria, and did not make Cleo's son Caesarion heir, but he did look into changing Roman laws so he could have more than one wife. So he may have been laying the groundwork to marry Cleo and legitimize their children. Of course, Caesar's assassination threw a wrench in that plan. So when Caesar was assassinated, there was a period when it wasn't clear who was going to engage in power or emerge in power. Regardless of her feelings about Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra's rule and her son's rule depended on a good relationship with whoever won, but now it wasn't clear who was going to win. And choosing the wrong side would seal her downfall. Both sides asked for aid because Cleopatra was a very rich client kingdom. And Egypt was a very rich client kingdom, but somehow it didn't get there. You know, lots of plausible deniability in what happened with this aid. Mark Antony defeated Caesar's assassins in 42 BC and was now looking to conquer Parthia, and he sent a message to Cleo to come on over so he could tell her that she was going to pick up the tab for his Parthia invasion. That was her chance to lock down the guy who had just emerged as the power in Rome. Winning over Antony was not a sure thing for Cleopatra, and here's how she did it. She played it cool. She did not go running to Mark Antony. She waited while the summonses from Antony piled up. And finally, when the anticipation had built to just a fever pitch, She sailed over in her luxury yacht flotilla, and it is very luxury fashion. And this was all calibrated exactly to his personality. And it worked. Mark Antony quickly forgot about invading Parthia and took up a new hobby, having people killed on Cleopatra's behalf.
And invading Cleopatra, let's be honest.
That too. I mean,
we just spent the entire Nudnick's panel trashing Mark Antony for this. So
yes,
we might as well.
It was a fun time. That might be our favorite hobby. So Cleopatra's next aim was to tie Antony to her, and she had 3 children with him and got him to acknowledge their kids as his own, which is something Caesar had not done with Caesarion. But eventually things went south, and Cleopatra and Mark Antony wound up on a beach at Actium, facing down Octavian, Julius Caesar's heir. This was the battle at Actium. Cleo's plan A was a sea battle against Octavian. Now, this battle could have gone a lot of different ways, and the way it went was doubtlessly influenced by Cleopatra. The Roman generals argued for a land battle. Cleopatra argued just as strongly for a sea battle. Ultimately, Antony listened to Cleo, and this was a battle at sea. But as things got really nasty, Cleo sailed her guard of 60 warships through Octavian's blockade and away in the direction of Alexandria. Antony chased after her, abandoning his navy. So the big question here is, was Cleopatra's desertion at Actium plan B or plan A? Cassius Dio claims that Cleopatra lost her nerve. Other writers say that this was part of the plan all along, that Antony knew that he was beaten and never intended to fight, but only to distract Octavian long enough to break through the blockade with Cleopatra and Cleopatra's money. The evidence for Plan A is that warships were huge rowboats at that time that used all available space for rowers and oars. They did not put sails and rigging on the boats unless they knew they were going to use them. It would have been very difficult for Cleo to hide sails and rigging from Antony, so this had to be part of the plan. Antony had to know about it in advance. The evidence for Plan B is that Antony was clearly upset about this, according to the sources. Remember, the sources are imperfect. According to Plutarch, Antony caught up with Cleopatra's ship and boarded it and then refused to speak to her out of anger, shame, or both. So after losing the battle at Actium, most of Mark Antony's army deserted. Now the 2 of them were stuck in Alexandria trying to negotiate for their lives. Cleo's objectives were save her kids' lives, save her kids' kingdom, and save her own life, in that order. Her plan A was some elaborate and grandiose schemes. And I love this about Cleopatra. I find this relatable somehow.
Totally relatable. I love that Cleopatra literally had so many backup plans at this point in her life. We always think that at this point in her life, everything is the worst and she makes decisions that we don't quite understand. But she was always playing the chess game several moves ahead of everyone else.
Absolutely. So some of her last-ditch backup plans include behead Artavasdes, king of Armenia, who'd been in her prison for the past 3 years, and send the head to some rivals looking for troops and help, which did not work. Found a new kingdom in Spain, or maybe there was fun to be had in India, potentially. Cleo's India plan was especially bold. She made plans to lift her remaining fleet of 50 massive warships out of the Mediterranean and drag them 40 miles over the desert through to be launched in the Red Sea. Cleo actually tried this, but she'd recently antagonized the Nabateans, a tribe in the area, and they were so mad that as soon as Cleo's warships emerged on their shores, they burned them. So that also did not work. Cleopatra's plan B was to negotiate with Octavian. So while she engaged in all of her plan A's, Cleo had a plan B that was maybe a little more realistic. Negotiate a deal with Octavian. But she did this separately from Antony. They were both trying to negotiate their own deals. So some steps that she took were to ask Octavian to allow her to pass down her kingdom to her children, offer to abdicate in favor of Caesarion, and she even sent a golden crown, throne, and scepter, once despised emblems of kingship, to Octavian. And the Romans did not like kings, but they were kind of in transition about that one, so who knows? But Octavian couldn't let Caesarion rule Egypt. Caesarion was Caesar's son, which made him more legitimate than Octavian. He couldn't let Caesarion live. Octavian offered to let Cleo stay in Egypt if she would have Antony murdered or exiled, which she did not do. So Plan C is Cleo's final exit strategy. Cleopatra still had something Octavian wanted, her money. The Ptolemaic wealth was legendary, and Octavian wanted it. As an insurance plan, while she was negotiating, she ordered a very flammable mausoleum built for herself, and even as she negotiated with Octavian, she had all her wealth moved into her tomb. And if she did not get what she wanted, she would go down into that flammable mausoleum with all that very flammable treasure, bar the door, and burn the whole thing down. And records show that she had other plans besides death by fire. Plutarch tells us that around this time, Cleopatra started getting interested in poisons, testing them on prisoners who were already sentenced to death. And she also made plans for her kids. During negotiations, she tried to preserve her kingdom and allow her kids, Caesarion specifically, I believe, to rule, and that didn't work. So she sent Caesarion on a ship to India with his tutor. But Caesarion was betrayed by that tutor who persuaded him to return to Egypt, where Octavian had him executed. So Cleopatra turned to suicide when all else was lost, and that was Plan C. In the most well-known version of the story, it was an asp that killed her, and it was hidden in a basket of figs. I mean, everybody knows that story, right? But even as far back as Plutarch and Dio, people have been doubting the asp story. And Plutarch points out that no snake was ever found in Cleopatra's room or on her clothes. And also by asp, it's important to note that usually what the ancients meant was a 6-foot-long Egyptian cobra, which is not the type of snake that you can hide just in a fig basket. So some scholars believe she took poison, either by drinking it or rubbing it on her skin, which would have been faster acting and potentially more effective. Others suggested that Octavian may have orchestrated this himself, and he had motive to want her dead, because as long as she and her children lived, they were a threat to his plans for Egypt, which involved making it a very rich province of his own. So there you have it. That is the story of Cleopatra. She had endless backup plans to preserve her own life and preserve her own kingdom and potentially her children's kingdom. But unfortunately, in the swiftly moving currents of the ancient world, you can never have too many backup plans. I think that's basically it.
Yeah, that's our presentation. So if people have questions, we are here to answer any questions you have.
That was brilliant. So I think Cleopatra, she's one of those people from, well, one of the big names in history who everybody learns about. Yeah, so yeah, if there's any questions, please put them in the chat and I shall field them to Genn and Jenny. Whilst people were doing that. Sorry?
The cool thing about Cleopatra that we found out when we were doing the research is, like Jenny said at the beginning, you think her life was so smooth and that everything kind of was almost divinely planned, but to know how tumultuous Egypt was and how often she was thrown out or exiled or had to continually remake herself in an image that would suit her survival is absolutely incredible. She's one of those people who's a true survivor and chameleon. And you watch her reinventing herself over and over again.
I think just the reinventing is a really cool thing too, because she reinvented herself with the men she was with. Like, for example, with Julius Caesar, I think what she really emphasized in her relationship with him, I mean, just based on what we know in the sources, and I could be extrapolating and fan fictioning a bit here, which I do, but there was a real intellectual connection. And you really see that when you look at the plans that Caesar was making when he went back to Rome. And one of the ones that I didn't list, there was a longer list when I started this out, was that Julius Caesar had this whole plan to remake the calendar. And so like the Julian calendar, I think is that the one we use today, Jen, or is that like the one we use today with some adjustments? I honestly forget.
I think it's the one we use today with some adjustments.
I think it is, yeah. And the way that he did it was based on, according to the sources, it was based on I think like Cleopatra had brought along her own astrologers, her own, people who watch the stars and did these things. So he was consulting with Cleopatra's staff and probably her to do that and to remake his own image. Like he really moved towards a more pharaonic or like kind of Egyptian-like way of conceiving himself, that had to do with representing himself as a god, which was very anathema to how the ancient Romans did things. And that was like you had to see Cleopatra like whispering in his ear. And Stacy Schiff talks about this in her outstanding biography of Cleopatra. Just like, why aren't they, you know, I'm a god in my country. Why aren't they calling you a god and worshiping you as a god in your country? You
And I
know?
think, you know, we talked about this. We had the Nutniks panel earlier, and we really skewered poor Mark Antony. But one of the things that we talked about in that panel was, you know, you can see, you know, Cleopatra is actually shaping the empire here. You're going from, you know, you've got Julius Caesar, who's just overthrown, you know, the Senate. He's set up a dictatorship for life. And now Cleopatra is changing that just a little bit more. She's turning him into, well, if you could be a dictator for life, you could be descendant of a god, and you could also be a god on this earth. And then as you watch the Roman Empire's lines going down, particularly Augustus and his succession problems that he has later, that is all set up by Cleopatra's hand in the background, that invisible hand that changed who rules and how they get to rule.
Yeah, but
actually,
I think just
sorry, there's a question related to that actually from Greta, where she's asking, did Cleopatra's depiction as pharaoh or queen change during her rule, or was she depicted traditionally for all of her life? So we've seen that she's had an impact on Caesar, but how does her image change?
how does she depict herself? I mean, I know that she depicted herself a lot as Isis. I'm not exactly sure how much that changed. What do you think, Jen?
She depicted herself as Isis amongst her people. And she really, as Jenny mentioned, worked very hard. She was the only Ptolemaic pharaoh who learned the actual Egyptian language. She was a hardcore populist. So what she did for her people was give them an image of someone that they could relate to in ways they hadn't had with the Ptolemaic pharaohs thus far. Throughout her reign, she depicted herself as Isis, and when she eventually shacks up with Mark Antony, she depicts him as the new Dionysus, and he has a really interesting role as her consort. He's not ruling, he has no power, she has the power, and he is just very happy to kind of be stay-at-home consort husband. And it's very unusual in how we view Roman men, and particularly a famous Roman general. I don't think that her depiction on like money and things like that changed. I know she went from the beginning of her life, when she was, you know, dealing with all the turmoil of ruling, she really solidified her image as a populist, and I think she continued to lean into that very heavily, shall we say.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit difficult to say she was a populist when basically she was a colonizer and like someone who represented herself as a goddess, you know, not just a ruler. So but it is true that she was a populist, or at least she like wanted to have the trappings of populism in order to not get on too much of the wrong side of what she probably would have seen as the angry Egyptian mob, you know?
Yeah, she got on the wrong side of them at least twice in her life. She was like, I cannot afford to get on the wrong side of them a third time. And that's potentially why her final exit strategy was what it was. You know, like if she had abdicated her role and let Egypt fall to Octavian as he wanted, that would have spelled the end for her as a pharaoh, and also as, you know, as everything she could achieve as a ruler.
Yeah.
Yes, I think with obviously the Ptolemies being Greek ruling Egypt, and then the Romans coming in as well, there must have been a lot of, what do you think the general population thought? Was there strife? She said that she learnt the local language, so that was obviously important for her plans. Was that all part of maybe a way of her really trying to secure her position with another external force coming in the Romans?
I think it absolutely was. It was one of her backup plans. I think it was one of her plan A's from when she was a kid, you know? Like as we showed in our presentation, I don't know exactly what time she learned all the languages that she knew. She supposedly spoke 9 languages, including the ancient Egyptian language. And I think that she had just looking at her early life and what she had seen, it'd be reasonable to assume that she had a plan from her early life on to appeal to the common people as a ruling strategy. Like she must have been looking at what her dad went through, what her relatives went through, and you know how her dad came on the throne even, and said, you know, I've got to do this a different way. Right. So I believe that she must have done that. I think that what the common people must have thought, well, number one, it really depends on when, right? They did not like Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar came into Alexandria, you know, waving around all the sigils of Roman domination. He had his eagles, he had his lictors, he's marching around in a, you know, crimson cape and stuff. Julius Caesar was the mob whisperer. Like, he was good at angry mobs. He was a populist, but he really did not nail it in Alexandria. And I think he just didn't care at that point. And that, of course, turned against him because he wound up being barricaded in the palace under siege from basically what we were referring to as the angry Egyptian mob, but also backed by the official Egyptian army with Ptolemy I think it's 13th. Which one are we at now? I think Cleopatra's little brother.
I always say I'm 11.
I'm 11, that kid. Yeah, but so they hated him to the point where they were ready to do some very extreme violence. They loved Mark Antony though.
He really loved Mark Antony, which is very surprising because Mark Antony is usually the kind of person who stirs up a lot of trouble, but he had the touch with the Egyptian people, and I think it's because he really did take a step back and let Cleopatra shine, and he really embraced the culture and the trappings of Egyptian wealth. And, you know, unlike Caesar, Mark Antony, he really enjoyed wearing Egyptian clothes. He really got into his role as a consort and wasn't sort of trying to, at this point, change anything. Like, he would go to all of the big Egyptian festivals at Cleopatra's side, doing the sort of spouse role. You know, he was the first man. He was like maybe one of history's first man, and he quite enjoyed it. I think with Cleopatra and the mob, the really important thing is that she understood that power, and she understood what happened if she didn't have that power. And you know, she was in a very precarious situation. She'd watched her sister be executed for getting on the wrong side, and you know, I can't stress this enough. The Ptolemies, their family line was a circle, and they very much were like the Targaryen family. They were intermarrying. Their love language was sending each other severed limbs, and they were constantly jockeying for power on the throne.
Yeah, it really seemed to be a family sport. How big was Alexandria more or less at this point is such a great question. I don't know. That's probably something you could Google, though.
Yeah, I don't know offhand. I do know that part of the reason these mobs would get so angry was the wealth disparity that was going on.
Huge wealth disparity.
As we mentioned, Cleopatra really loved to show off, shower the people with like huge events, like, you know, the traditional bread and circuses, like the slaughter of the Bacchus Bill, which was a huge thing for their ceremonial calendar. But she also was constantly giving support. She was giving food away to Rome to secure her place, because she knew that the mob could overthrow you, but a Roman army could keep you in your place. And as a result, you had a famine going on and several droughts. People were not being fed, and like, King and Queening 101 is feed your people or lose your throne. And Cleopatra was really walking this line quite a lot throughout her queenship.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think the dynamic, when we talk about angry mobs, I think number one, there's some really cool, colorful descriptions in Plutarch of what the I guess the angry mob culture was like in ancient Egypt, you know. But you, again, take everything in the ancient sources here with a grain of salt, because there's a lot of prejudice. There's a lot of, you know, anti-Eastern prejudice, that the way, like, things that they put on Egypt and other countries about this stuff, like, oh, their mobs are more violent than our mobs, and like, you know, ancient Rome really shouldn't talk there, right? Like they were kind of like ostensibly a democracy, but in certain ways also ruled by angry mobs. So I think this is an ancient world problem, not necessarily an Egypt problem by itself per se, but I would also say that the wealth disparity problem in Egypt was particularly bad. And during Ptolemaic Egyptian times, the Ptolemies were Greek. They spoke only Greek, most of them. There was a Greek ruling class. They educated their kids using the Greek system. They worshipped Greek gods. They were not culturally Egyptian. They were colonizers. And this also led to a lot of you know, cultural, like, you know, a lot of resentment, a lot of anger. And again, as Jen said, like, a lot of the time they're sending stuff to Rome. Like, they were being client kingdom of Rome at a certain point, and they were their breadbasket. So there was famine on there, and the pharaohs were sending grain in giant barges to Rome. I mean, that would make anybody mad.
And, you know, we talked again earlier in our Done Next panel about the angry mobs in Rome. Mobs in Egypt were, you know, they could change the course of who was ruling. The same was true in Rome.
Absolutely.
We know that, you know, I mean, famously, you have the death of Caesar, you have his funeral, you have the angry mob that wanted to tear the assassins limb from limb after Mark Antony's impassioned speech that Shakespeare immortalizes. But we know that actually mobs and the people who controlled those mobs, they worked, you know, to essentially overtly overthrow governments. And this was incredibly common in both areas. Mobs had a lot of power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think that there was any way that Cleopatra could have survived? Do you think, because you're saying she had lots of plans, but is there any way she might have been able to go on and continue ruling Egypt, probably under Roman domination?
That was her whole plan the first time. Like, but I don't think once Octavian came into power that was in play. But what do you think, Jen?
No, I mean, Octavian was, you have the immovable object and then the unstoppable force, and that's what you had here. And what Cleopatra knew was she knew several things. Octavian would not bargain for what she needed. If she was to try to continue ruling Egypt, one of the things that Octavian really wanted was he wanted her to march in his triumph. And the idea of that was so anathema, and it just would have been so destructive to her in general. She would have lived as essentially a figurehead, only constantly under the threat of Octavian at his mercy. Octavian and Julius Caesar had this thing where they considered it to be merciful to allow their enemies sometimes to live or to have power, but they always knew that that mercy had a sword over their head. And I think Cleopatra knew, even if Octavian let her live and she went with his deal, the potential was her own people wouldn't let her live. The angry mob would rip her limb from limb, because she'd finally given over to Roman rule.
That's one possibility. Another possibility, because this has happened before with her sister, not Berenice, the other one, Arsinoe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Arsinoe got defeated by Rome, and Arsinoe walked in a Roman triumph, and Arsinoe was sent to the temple at Ephesus or something, isn't that right?
Yeah.
And eventually she was assassinated by Mark Antony under Cleopatra's orders. She was one of the people that Antony assassinated on behalf of Cleopatra early in their relationship. I mean, Cleopatra would have been living under that threat too, I think, because as I said at the end of the presentation, Octavian had reason for it to be more convenient for him if she was not with us anymore, so.
And you see that in the moves he eventually makes with her children. I mean, obviously we know that Caesarion is assassinated, but her actual children that she had with Mark Antony, they all get married off, but none of them stay, as far as I remember, and I could be wrong, none of them stay within Rome. Many of them wind up in different farther provinces. Like, he doesn't want Cleopatra's children with Mark Antony to be in a place where they have power. He wants them sent further afield.
Yeah, now that I think about it, there was the two twins, Cleopatra Selene and Alexander Helios, and then there was Ptolemy Philadelphus, who was the little boy, the younger brother. I don't believe either of the boys lived, I think, into adulthood, but I don't think they had long lives. I'm not sure what happened to them, or they could have just dropped out of the public record. We really don't know. Cleopatra Selene was married off to I think one of the Jubas or something, in North Africa, and she was went far from Rome. So yeah, I could be wrong in my memory of this, but I think that's.
No, I think you're right. It's something like that happened. So it was very clear that Octavian would take none of Antony's children too close to Rome. They did stay
when they were younger.
I feel like Octavia, unfortunately, ran the home for Mark Antony's wayward children. She really got a bum rap in history. She wound up just having to deal with so much nonsense. But as they got older and marriageable age, Octavian did not want them anywhere near Rome or power, because even though Antony had not the best ending, his name still had a lot of cachet, and the Julian Claudians were made up of Mark Antony's children with Octavia. So there was a lot of power in that name.
We've got 4 minutes left.
Oh.
So if there's any more questions, please fill them out. Or for me, if I think of Cleopatra, she's often seen as quite a romantic figure in like film and cinema and things. But her life, there's nothing like that. It seems so stressful. I mean, you couldn't imagine.
Very stressful life, yes. She had to improvise all the time. She was making decisions constantly. Like she always had a backup plan.
Yeah, and she had no choice. That's how power swung in the ancient world. She had to be one step ahead of what was going next. I mean, you know, her biggest plan, her biggest safety she thought she had was Julius Caesar. And when that went wrong, like she was in Rome, she had to get out real quick because there is a real potential if she hadn't gone out as fast as she had, she would have been assassinated next, and Egypt would have just immediately become, you know, Roman dominated.
Yeah, I mean, Rome also had an angry mob problem.
Exactly.
So.
And she was a queen.
Yep. They did not like queens.
No.
No. I think we probably need to wrap it up here. So if there's anything else you want to add or plug before
we are Ancient History Fangirl. Our podcast comes out weekly on Thursdays. We also have a book. Our book is called Women of Myth. It's behind me. Yes. It's out now from Simon & Schuster. You can find us on all the socials. We're at Ancient History Fangirl or at Ancient Hist Fan on Twitter. I refuse to call it X because X is stupid.
Here. Good job. I have nothing to add to that. That was perfect.
No.
Well, amazing. Thank you very much. That was a really, really good talk. Yeah, fantastic. And
thank you.
Right at the end as well, answering the questions. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.